There are terrors in the galaxy that can be quantified. You can count the teeth in an orc's snarl, measure the range of a plasma cannon, calculate the trajectory of an orbital bombardment. But there exists a horror that defies such simple mathematics, a fate that the Administratum's endless scrolls barely acknowledge in their sterile records. It is the slow, grinding death of a world cut loose from the Imperium's embrace, a planet whose name has been struck from the registers, whose coordinates have been redacted from star charts, whose people have been consigned to a darkness more absolute than the void between stars. In the grim darkness of the far future, abandonment is not merely a possibility, it is an inevitability. The Imperium of Man spans approximately 1 million worlds scattered across the Milky Way galaxy, though the true number remains unknown and perhaps unknowable. The Adeptus Administratum dedicates entire departments to cataloguing these worlds, yet this task remains eternally incomplete, for the Imperium exists in a state of constant flux. New planets are discovered, colonized, or conquered, even as old ones are lost to the innumerable threats that press against humanity from all sides. The bureaucrats of terror speak of manifest destiny, of humanity's divine right to rule the entire galaxy. But the truth, carved into every void ship's hull and etched onto every soldier's heart, is far more desperate. The Imperium is not expanding. It is barely holding on. Consider for a moment the sheer impossibility of governing such an empire. Between each settled world lies not empty space, but an ocean of darkness measured in light years. Distances so vast that human minds struggle to comprehend them. A traveler could cross from one edge of the Imperium to the other, traversing 100,000 light-years of space, and never once encounter another human being. The worlds themselves cluster around areas first settled during the lost age of technology, forming sectors that contain perhaps 200 star systems each, connected by relatively stable warp routes. But between these sectors stretch the regions known as wilderness space, unexplored depths that harbor terrors, both known and unimaginable. The Imperium's control over its domain is not the iron grip that propaganda suggests. It is a spiderweb spanning the galaxy, strong at certain points, but gossamer thin in others, and constantly being torn by forces beyond mortal comprehension. Warp storms can isolate entire sectors for years or centuries. Xenos invasions can cut supply lines that took millennia to establish. Internal rebellions can spread like cancer through neighboring systems. And sometimes, most terrifyingly of all, a world simply fades from the Imperium's awareness, lost in the endless churning of bureaucratic machinery, its tithes uncollected, its prayers unanswered, its existence slowly eroding into myth and memory. When a world is abandoned by the Imperium, whether through deliberate choice or bureaucratic oversight, its name is officially excised from the Administratum's volumes. These are not gentle edits or temporary suspensions. The scribes who perform this task do so with the solemnity of funeral rites, for they understand they are inscribing a death sentence for millions or billions of souls. The abandoned world is no longer offered the Imperium's aid or protection. Imperial trade routes are redefined to exclude it. Astropathic communications go unanswered. Tithe collectors never arrive. The protection of the Imperial Navy, the enforcement of the Adeptus Arbites, the spiritual guidance of the ecclesiarchy, all of it simply ceases as though a switch has been thrown. The reasons for abandonment are as varied as the stars themselves. A massive warp storm might render a world unreachable, cutting it off from conventional travel for decades or centuries. Strategic considerations might force the Imperium to withdraw from indefensible positions, concentrating forces elsewhere, while entire populations are left to fend for themselves. A world might fail to provide its tithe one too many times, accumulating debts of food, weapons, or soldiers until the Administratum deems it more trouble than it is worth. Or most cruelly of all, a simple clerical error might cause a planet to slip through the cracks of the vast bureaucratic machine, its existence forgotten by all except those who live and die upon its surface. The official position of the Adeptus Terra holds that all of humanity and the entire galaxy exist under the Emperor's rule. Every human world, whether known or unknown, discovered or lost, remains part of the Imperium in the eyes of faith. But faith does not fill empty bellies. Faith does not power failing reactors. Faith does not turn back Xenos raiders or Chaos cultists when no Space Marines answer the call for aid. The harsh reality is that the Imperium's reach exceeds its grasp, and millions of worlds exist in a twilight state between official Imperial control and total isolation, sustained only by the fading memory of the Emperor's light. To understand what it means to live on an abandoned world, one must first understand what is lost. The Imperium, for all its cruelty and oppression, provides structure. It enforces order through the barrel of a bolter and the edge of a power sword, yes, but it is order nonetheless. It connects worlds separated by impossible distances into a functioning, if barely coherent, whole. A hive world produces manufactorum goods. An agri world grows food. A forge world crafts weapons and vehicles. A mining world extracts raw materials. Each world specializes, contributing its particular resources to the greater machine, sustained by the goods produced by countless other planets, light years distant. This interdependence creates vulnerability. Few Imperial worlds are truly self-sufficient. A hive world might house billions upon billions of people, but it cannot feed them all from its own resources. The food must be imported from agri-worlds, transported across the void in massive cargo haulers, distributed through networks of trade that span entire sectors. A forge world might possess the technological knowledge to craft wonder weapons, but it requires raw materials from dozens of mining worlds and food to sustain its workforce. Break these connections, and the entire system begins to collapse like a building whose foundation has been removed. The first days, when the ships stop coming. The realization does not come all at once. It never does. The Imperium runs on cycles measured in years and decades, its ponderous machinery grinding forward with the inevitability of tectonic plates. A tithe collector's ship might be delayed by warp storms or mechanical failure. An astropathic message might be lost in the screaming chaos of the immaterium. Merchant vessels might divert to more profitable routes without bothering to inform local authorities. First, these absences seem like nothing more than the usual inefficiencies of the Imperium's vast bureaucracy, minor inconveniences in the eternal grind of Imperial life. The planetary governor's advisors offer reassurances. The delay is temporary. The next tithe vessel will arrive soon. There is no cause for alarm. Perhaps the calendrical calculations were incorrect, or perhaps Terra has granted the world a brief reprieve from its obligations. The Adeptus Ministorum preachers lead prayers for the safe arrival of the delayed ships, their voices carrying through crowded cathedral naves as the faithful bow their heads and chant litanies of patience and devotion. Life continues as it always has, the daily routines of work and prayer unchanged by the growing silence from the stars. But as weeks stretch into months, the unease begins to spread. The astropaths sequestered in their sanctums grow increasingly agitated, straining their psychic senses toward the Astronomicon, that great psychic lighthouse emanating from Terra that guides navigators through the warp. They report nothing, or worse than nothing, a static that might be interference or might be something moving in the spaces between their thoughts. The Adeptus Arbites, those enforcers of imperial law, send increasingly frantic messages to their superiors in neighboring systems, but receive no response. The Planetary Defense Force conducts drills with ammunition they cannot replace, preparing for threats they can barely imagine. On a hive world, the first signs of crisis manifest in the lower levels. The great vertical cities that house billions upon billions of souls function like machines, and machines require fuel. Food shipments arrive on a strict schedule, calculated down to the ton, rationed and distributed through sprawling networks of distribution centers and food halls. The people of the hive are accustomed to their corpse starch rations. those compressed blocks of recycled organic matter that form the staple diet of the imperial masses. The food is tasteless and barely nutritious, but it is food, and it arrives with mechanical regularity, until it does not. The first missed shipment causes barely a ripple. Rations are reduced slightly, stretching reserves to cover the gap. Officials assure the populace this is temporary, a minor logistical issue that will be resolved shortly. But when the second shipment fails to arrive, and then the third, the carefully maintained illusion of stability begins to crack. The vast hab blocks that honeycomb the hive begin to empty their stockpiles, administrators reluctantly breaking into emergency reserves intended for siege or catastrophe. And still the ships do not come. Panic sets in slowly, then all at once. Those who can afford it begin hoarding food, buying up supplies at inflated prices, filling their quarters with enough provisions to last weeks or months. The black markets that exist in every hive explode into prominence, dealing in commodities that suddenly mean the difference between life and death. A kilogram of corpse starch that once cost a few throne geld now commands prices that would have bought luxury goods. Armed gangs raid distribution centers, making off with entire shipments meant for thousands of families. The Adeptus Arbites attempt to maintain order, but they are few, and the hive is vast, and even enforcers need to eat. The governor's palace becomes a fortress. Those nobles and merchants wealthy enough to afford passage off-world begin liquidating assets, converting holdings into portable wealth, bribing ship captains for berths on vessels that might carry them to safety. Some succeed, fleeing aboard private yachts or merchant vessels, abandoning their world to its fate. Others find that the merchants who once courted their business have departed, that the void above their world is empty of all save orbital debris and the cold light of distant stars. They are trapped, their wealth suddenly worthless in a world where food has become more valuable than gold. On agri-worlds, the crisis takes a different form. These planets exist to feed the Imperium, vast expanses of carefully managed farmland, worked by populations that seldom exceed a few million spread across entire continents. The agri-worlds are self-sufficient in food by necessity, but they depend utterly on the Imperium for everything else. Their farm equipment comes from forge worlds. Their planetary defenses consist of weapons purchased or tithed from the Departamento Munitorum. Their very purpose is defined by their place in the imperial machine. When the tithe collectors stop arriving, the farmers face a cruel choice. They have food, more food than they could possibly consume themselves, enough to feed billions on distant hive worlds. But what use is food if there is no one to buy it? The grain rots in silos designed for temporary storage, never meant to hold harvests indefinitely. Livestock must still be fed, fields must still be planted, but for what purpose? The work continues because it is all the people know, generations of tradition and imperial decree driving them forward, even as the reason for their labor evaporates like morning dew. Some agri-world governors, seeing the writing etched in letters of fire across the void, attempt to adapt. They encourage their populations to spread out, to abandon the concentrated agricultural zones and return to a more distributed way of life. Small settlements spring up across previously empty lands, farmers staking claims to territories their families will work for generations. It is a step backward, a return to a more primitive existence, but it is survival. Others cling to the old ways, maintaining the vast industrial farms, even as they become monuments to an absent empire, waiting for tithe collectors who will never return. Forge worlds face perhaps the most immediate crisis. These planets are massive industrial complexes, every inch of their surface given over to manufactorums and forged temples where the Adeptus Mechanicus shapes metal and plasma into instruments of the Emperor's will. A Forge world's population consists largely of tech priests and their armies of servitors, those lobotomized cyborg workers who form the backbone of imperial industry. But servitors must be maintained, manufactorums require raw materials, and most critically, almost nothing on a Forge world is edible. The tech priests pride themselves on logic and calculation, on their ability to reduce all problems to equations of resource allocation and probability. When the supply ships stop arriving, they calculate exactly how long their stockpiles will last. They know to the hour when their stored food will run out. They know to the day when critical raw materials will be exhausted, when the manufacturers will fall silent for lack of ore and chemicals. They recalculate ratios, attempting to stretch supplies, but mathematics cannot create food from nothing, and logic provides cold comfort when the forges begin to go dark. Some forge worlds have contingencies, hidden reserves, or emergency protocols established during the Great Crusade, when the possibility of isolation was a recognized threat. These worlds might possess hydroponics facilities capable of feeding skeleton crews, or reserves of raw materials sufficient to maintain critical systems for years. But many forge worlds were established in the long millennia following the Horus Heresy, designed with the assumption that the Imperium would endure forever, that supply chains 10,000 years old would never fail. For these worlds, abandonment is a death sentence that will take time to execute, but is no less certain for the delay. Feudal worlds and feral worlds, those planets still trapped in pre-industrial or even pre-technological states, might seem better positioned to survive isolation. They are already self-sufficient by necessity. Their people living lives, barely touched by the wider Imperium, except when the tithe collectors arrive to claim their due in flesh and service, taking the strongest youths to serve in the Imperial Guard. When the ships stop coming, these worlds continue much as they always have, their populations farming and hunting and making war on each other in blissful ignorance of the greater catastrophe unfolding across the galaxy. But even these worlds are not immune to abandonment's consequences. The Imperial Governor, usually drawn from off-world or from a family that has ruled for generations under Imperial aegis, loses legitimacy when the Imperium fails to support their authority. Local warlords begin to question why they should pay taxes or provide soldiers to a distant emperor whose representatives no longer visit. Civil wars erupt as various factions struggle for dominance, each claiming they represent the true continuation of imperial authority. The PDF, trained and equipped to fight Xenos or heretics, finds itself turned against its own people in brutal internecine conflicts. Worse still, the Imperium's presence, however minimal, served a purpose on these worlds. It suppressed knowledge of chaos, hunted down witches and mutants, maintained at least a veneer of order and orthodoxy. Without ecclesiarchy preachers to lead devotions and arbites to enforce imperial law, old superstitions resurface. Chaos cults that existed in secret for generations emerge into the open, preaching that the emperor has abandoned these worlds because the people were insufficiently faithful, or because the emperor was never worthy of worship in the first place. Untrained psychers, who would have been collected by the black ships and either trained or sacrificed to sustain the Golden Throne, instead become walking gateways for demonic possession, economic collapse, and famine. The Imperium's economy, such as it is, functions on a principle of enforced cooperation, backed by overwhelming military might. Worlds produce, according to their designated function, and tithe a portion of their production to Terra. In return, they receive access to the wider imperial economy, trading goods and services with other worlds in their sector or beyond. The throne gelt serves as a common currency across countless disparate worlds, its value guaranteed not by any inherent worth, but by the understanding that the Imperium will crush anyone who refuses to accept it. When a world is cut off from this system, its currency becomes worthless almost overnight. What good is a piece of metal or a data slip promising payment from the administratum when there is no administratum to honor that promise? The wealthy discover that their fortunes exist only as numbers in ledgers, as claims on resources they can no longer access. A merchant prince who once commanded the loyalty of thousands through the power of his wealth finds himself no richer than the laborers who work his now silent manufactorums. For in a collapsing economy, physical goods become the only currency that matters. Barter economies emerge from the wreckage. A worker with technical skills might trade repairs for food. A farmer with surplus grain can command prices in goods or services that would have seemed absurd in the days of imperial plenty. Hoarding becomes endemic. Every individual or family stockpiling whatever they can get their hands on against an uncertain future. The social contract that held society together, already strained under the oppressive weight of imperial rule, snaps like a cord pulled too tight. On hive worlds, the collapse is particularly catastrophic. These massive urban complexes were never designed to be self-sufficient. Their populations number in the billions, packed into hive cities that stretch kilometers into the sky and deep into the planet's crust. The entire structure of a hive depends on constant importation of food, water, and raw materials. The hive's own recycling systems can reclaim some resources, processing waste and the dead into new materials. But they cannot create matter from nothing. Every recycling process loses efficiency, produces less than it consumes. Without constant input from outside, a hive begins to cannibalize itself, breaking down its own infrastructure to sustain its population for a few more months or years. The first to starve are the inhabitants of the lower hive, those countless billions who exist in the darkness, far below the spires where the wealthy make their homes. These people lived on the edge of starvation even in the best of times, subsisting on minimal rations while laboring in manufactorums and chemical works that ground human bodies into industrial output. When the rations stop flowing down from above, they begin to die in numbers that defy comprehension. Thousands, then millions, then tens of millions perish in the lower levels, their bodies left to rot in the darkness, because there is no one left with the strength to perform burial rites. Survivors turn on each other with a savagery born of desperation. Gang violence, always present in the lower hive, explodes into open warfare as different factions fight for control of remaining food stores. Cannibalism becomes commonplace, the old taboos eroding under the simple drive to survive. The corpse starch factories, those facilities that recycled the dead into food, become sites of horrific battles as gangs fight for control of the machinery and the raw materials that fuel it. The Imperium, in its cruelty, had created a system where the dead fed the living, and now that system continues in a form more brutal than the administratum could have imagined. The upper hive fares better at first. The spire dwellers have stockpiles and the means to protect them. Private armies loyal to noble houses establish perimeters, creating fortified enclaves where the wealthy attempt to maintain something resembling their former lifestyles. They dine on delicacies while the levels below them descend into chaos, confident that their walls and weapons will keep them safe. But walls can only hold back desperation for so long, and when the starving masses of the lower hive come flooding upward, driven by a hunger that overcomes all fear, even the best defenses begin to crumble. Some hives implement population control measures that would horrify even the Imperium's darkest enforcers. They seal entire levels, condemning millions to death by starvation or suffocation, preserving resources for those above. They institute purges, executing anyone deemed non-essential to the hive's survival. They create lottery systems where families must sacrifice members to reduce the burden on remaining food stocks. These measures buy time, nothing more. A hive without external supply cannot sustain its population indefinitely. The mathematics are brutal and unyielding. Eventually, one way or another, the population must decrease to match available resources, and the methods by which this decrease occurs are universally terrible. Forge worlds face a different kind of death. The tech priests who rule these planets are not fools. They understand efficiency and resource management better than any planetary governor or merchant prince. When they realize the Imperium is not coming back, they implement protocols designed to maximize survival. Non-essential forges are shut down. Servitor populations are reduced. The excess units deactivated or disassembled for parts. Food production is rationalized, with every calorie accounted for and distributed according to strict hierarchies of importance. But even the Adeptus Mechanicus cannot manufacture food from machine spirits and prayers to the Omnissiah. As stockpiles dwindle, the tech priests face choices that challenge their fundamental beliefs. Do they maintain the great forge temples, those sacred spaces where the Omnissiah's power is channeled through arcane machinery, even as their acolytes starve? Or do they abandon their holy purpose to focus on simple survival? Different forge worlds answer this question differently, creating schisms within the Mechanicus that mirror the larger fractures tearing the abandoned worlds apart. Some forge worlds attempt desperate solutions. They convert manufactorums to produce hydroponic equipment, trying to establish sustainable food production. They send expeditions to nearby worlds in subsector, hoping to find agri-worlds or other sources of sustenance. They even resort to processing their own servitor populations into nutrient paste, a solution that's pragmatic but represents a moral dissent that many tech priests find difficult to accept, even as necessity drives them forward. The breakdown of order. Every society rests on a foundation of consent and coercion. The people must either believe in the system that governs them or fear the consequences of resisting it. The Imperium mastered this balance through 10,000 years of refinement, combining religious fervor with overwhelming military might to create a system where rebellion seemed not just futile, but spiritually damnable. But that system depended on the Imperium's presence, on the knowledge that Space Marines might arrive to punish dissent, that the Inquisition was watching for signs of heresy, that the Emperor's light reached even to the farthest corners of the galaxy. When a world is abandoned, this foundation crumbles. The planetary governor can issue decrees, but who enforces them when the Adeptus Arbites can no longer call for reinforcements? The ecclesiarchy can preach submission to the Emperor's will, but what power do those words hold when the Emperor seems to have turned his face away? The Planetary Defense Force can attempt to maintain order, but PDF soldiers are drawn from the local population, and they watch their own families starving alongside everyone else. At what point does a soldier's loyalty to his uniform become less important than his duty to keep his children alive? The collapse of authority follows predictable patterns across different world types, yet each planet's descent into chaos is unique in its details. On hive worlds, the breakdown often begins in the lower levels and spreads upward like fire climbing dry timber. The gang lords who once operated in the shadows emerge as warlords, claiming territory and resources with a brutal efficiency that makes the Imperium's rules seem benevolent by comparison. They are not revolutionaries or idealists. They are survivors who understand that power in a collapsing world belongs to those willing to seize it and hold it by any means necessary. The Adeptus Arbites, those black-armored enforcers of imperial law, find themselves overwhelmed and isolated. They are accustomed to operating as an occupying force, maintaining order through fear and exemplary punishment. A few Arbites can control thousands of civilians, when those civilians believe that resistance will bring retribution from the wider Imperium. But when the Imperium is gone, when the civilians have nothing left to lose, the mathematics change. The Arbites' fortresses become besieged strongholds, their inhabitants fighting desperate holding actions against populations that outnumber them thousands to one. Some Arbites units maintain discipline to the end, dying at their posts rather than abandoning their duty. Others negotiate safe passage, trading their weapons and equipment for the chance to escape with their lives. A few go rogue, using their training and gear to carve out petty kingdoms, becoming the very criminals they once hunted. The breakdown of the Arbites represents more than the loss of law enforcement. It signals that the Imperium's authority is dead, that the old rules no longer apply, that every person must now look to their own survival because no one else will. The Planetary Defense Force faces similar choices. These soldiers were trained to fight external threats, to defend their world against Xenos invasions or Chaos incursions. They were not prepared to shoot starving civilians or suppress bread riots. When the governor orders them to fire on protesters demanding food, some units obey. Others refuse. the soldiers breaking ranks to join their families rather than murder their neighbors. Officers who try to maintain discipline find themselves fragged by their own troops, their bodies left as warnings to anyone else who thinks the old hierarchies still matter. In some cases, the PDF splinters into competing factions, each claiming to represent legitimate authority. A colonel might declare himself the rightful planetary governor, arguing that the civilian leadership has lost the mandate to rule. A company might garrison a food depot and refuse to share its contents, trading supplies for loyalty and crushing anyone who threatens their control. These military units become warlords in all but name, using their weapons and training to dominate the civilian population. The PDF that was supposed to protect the world instead becomes another threat to survival. On agri-worlds, the collapse takes different forms. The dispersed populations are harder to control but also harder to govern. When the planetary governor, typically stationed in the world's single major city, tries to requisition food stores, the farmers refuse. Why should they give up their harvests to feed city dwellers who produce nothing useful? The governor might threaten military action, but the PDF on an agri-world is usually small, designed more for ceremony than actual combat. When the farmers band together, forming militias to protect their land and crops, the governor's threats prove empty. These agricultural communities often turn inward, becoming insular and suspicious of outsiders. They have food, which makes them wealthy beyond measure in a galaxy slowly starving, but it also makes them targets. Raiders from other settlements, or even from neighboring planets, might attempt to seize harvests by force. The farmers respond by fortifying their communities, building walls and training militias, transforming their settlements into small kingdoms, ruled by those strong enough to defend what they claim. The agri-world fragments into a patchwork of petty domains, each suspicious of its neighbors, trading cautiously when they trade at all. Civilized worlds, those planets closest to what we might recognize as normal human civilization, experience perhaps the most psychologically devastating collapse. These are worlds where people lived lives not so different from those in pre-imperial history, working regular jobs, raising families, participating in local governance within the bounds permitted by imperial law. When the Imperium withdraws, these worlds have infrastructure and institutions that might allow them to continue functioning independently. They have factories and farms, schools and hospitals, systems of government that predated imperial conquest and might survive its end. But they also have knowledge, and knowledge breeds questions. If the Emperor has abandoned them, was his rule ever legitimate? If the Imperium cannot or will not help, why should they continue following its laws? These questions lead to debates, then to protests, then to violence as different factions offer competing visions of what should come next. Some argue for maintaining imperial traditions, believing the Emperor will return and reward the faithful. Others call for radical restructuring, for democracy or socialism, or whatever ideology they think will work better than what they had. Still others simply want to secure what they can for themselves and their families, viewing the collapse as an opportunity rather than a catastrophe. The resulting conflicts are not clean or ideological. They are messy, brutal affairs where yesterday's neighbors become today's enemies over differences in belief or simply over access to resources. Libraries burn as different factions destroy knowledge they view as dangerous or heretical. Factories are sabotaged by workers who resent their former employers or by rival groups trying to prevent competitors from gaining advantage. The infrastructure that might have allowed these worlds to survive independently is destroyed in the fighting, each side convinced that victory is worth any price, unable to see that they are collectively guaranteeing their world's descent into barbarism. Religious institutions face their own crisis of faith and authority. The ecclesiarchy exists to maintain worship of the God Emperor, to interpret his will and guide the faithful in their devotions. But what happens when prayers go unanswered, when the Emperor's supposed divine protection fails so completely? Some preachers redouble their efforts, arguing that abandonment is a test of faith, that the truly devoted must believe even in the absence of evidence. They lead ever more fervent devotions, organizing flagellant processions and prayer marathons, convinced that sufficient faith will bring the emperor's attention back to their forsaken world. Others begin to question. If the emperor is truly divine, how could he allow this suffering? If he is all-knowing, how could he forget about entire worlds? These questions, once unthinkable, now spread through congregations like disease. Some preachers attempt to reconcile faith with reality, developing new theologies that acknowledge the emperor's distance while maintaining his divinity. Others break entirely, either descending into nihilism or, more dangerously, becoming receptive to other voices that whisper promises of power and salvation. The collapse of order is not uniform across an abandoned world. While some regions descend into violence and chaos, others manage to maintain stability through strong leadership or simple geographical isolation. A continent separated from the planet's main population centers by ocean or mountain range might barely notice the wider collapse, continuing much as it always has until external threats find it. An industrial city with capable leadership and defensible borders might transform into a city-state, providing security and resources in exchange for loyalty and labor. These pockets of stability become beacons in the darkness, attracting refugees from less fortunate regions. But this creates its own problems. How many refugees can a stable community absorb before it too collapses under the weight of mouths it cannot feed? Do they accept all who come, risking their own survival for humanitarian principles that the Imperium never valued? Or do they turn people away, perhaps violently, preserving their community at the cost of their souls? There are no good answers to these questions, only degrees of terrible choice. The darkness of chaos. In the grim darkness of the far future, the greatest threat to humanity is not the Xenos races that press against the Imperium from all sides. It is the darkness that dwells within the human heart itself, the weakness and despair and rage that makes men vulnerable to powers that should never be named. The Imperium understands this truth, though it rarely speaks it openly. This is why the ecclesiarchy preaches constant devotion to the emperor. This is why the Inquisition hunts heretics with such fervor. This is why knowledge of chaos is itself considered dangerous, why the mere possession of forbidden texts can earn a death sentence. When a world is abandoned by the Imperium, when the structures that suppressed and controlled humanity's darker impulses collapse, chaos finds fertile ground for its corruption. Not immediately, not all at once, but slowly, insidiously, like rot spreading through fruit. It begins with desperation and despair, with people who have lost everything and will do anything to survive or to make the pain stop. It feeds on the negative emotions that abandonment breeds: anger at the emperor who has forsaken them, fear of starvation or violence, hatred for those who have more than they do. The chaos cults that existed in secret during imperial rule emerge from the shadows. On every imperial world, there are those who worship the ruinous powers, who conduct forbidden rituals in hidden temples, who corrupt the innocent with whispered promises. The Imperium suppresses these cults ruthlessly, but it can never eliminate them entirely, for chaos is not an external enemy that can be defeated in battle, but a corruption that springs from within humanity itself. These cults survived through secrecy and subterfuge, hiding their true nature behind false fronts, practicing their blasphemies in darkness where the Inquisition's light could not reach. When the Imperium withdraws, the cults no longer need to hide. They can recruit openly, offering solutions to the problems that plague the abandoned world. Are people starving? Nurgle's worshippers can teach them to embrace decay, to find sustenance in things that should not be eaten, to survive in ways that destroy their humanity but keep their bodies alive. Is the social order collapsing into violence? Horns faithful offer strength and the power to crush enemies, turning rage and bloodlust into weapons that seem to promise security in a chaotic world. The most insidious are the cults of Tzeentch, the chaos god of change and ambition. They approach the desperate with promises of knowledge and power, offering paths to survival that seem rational and reasonable at first. A minor ritual to ensure crops grow in depleted soil, a simple pact to gain protection from raiders. These small corruptions lead to larger ones, each step taking the cultist further from humanity until they are so deeply compromised that redemption becomes impossible. Tzeentch's cults excel at patient corruption, building networks of influence that can subvert entire governments before anyone realizes what has happened. Slaanesh cults thrive on the breakdown of order in different ways. When law collapses and restraint becomes optional, the Prince of Pleasure finds willing servants among those who embrace excess as an escape from the grinding misery of survival. They create secret societies dedicated to sensory experience, to pleasure and pain, taken to extremes that would have horrified them in saner times. These cults often begin innocuously, as groups seeking to preserve some beauty or culture in a world descending into barbarism, but they metastasize into something monstrous, their pursuit of experience leading them to acts that would make even hardened criminals recoil. But the greatest threat comes not from organized cults, but from the untrained psychers who emerge in every human population. During the Age of Strife, uncontrolled psychers were one of humanity's greatest nightmares, their powers manifesting without warning and opening gateways for demonic entities to pour into reality. The Imperium learned from this mistake. It established the black ships that travel from world to world, collecting psychers and bringing them to Terra. There, they are tested. The strongest and most stable are trained as sanctioned psychers, their powers bound and controlled through force of will and psychic wards. The weak, or unstable, are sacrificed to the Golden Throne, their souls consumed to sustain the Emperor's immortal existence. This system is cruel, but effective. It ensures that most psychers never have the chance to become the weapons that chaos would make of them. But when a world is abandoned, when the black ships no longer visit, these individuals are left untrained and unprepared for the powers awakening within them. A child whose nightmares become real, a teenager whose anger causes spontaneous combustion, an adult whose moment of terror tears a hole in reality itself. Each untrained psyker is a potential gateway, a weakness in the skin of the universe that demons can exploit. The tragedies that result are horrific beyond description. A small farming community where a young psyker's fear during a raid allows a bloodthirster to manifest, the demons slaughtering everyone in the settlement before disappearing back into the warp. A hive city where a possessed psyker spreads a psychic plague, causing mass hallucinations and paranoia that lead to millions dying in riots and purges. An entire continent consumed when multiple psychers undergo synchronous manifestations, the collective tear in reality, allowing a full demon incursion that transforms the land into a nightmarish hellscape where the laws of physics no longer apply. Some abandoned worlds recognize the danger posed by psychers and attempt to address it through traditional means. They hunt down anyone showing signs of psychic ability and execute them, often in brutal public displays meant to discourage others from manifesting or hiding their powers. This creates its own horrors, as frightened families turn in their own children, as witch hunters gain power and prestige by finding scapegoats to burn, as the criteria for identifying psychers becomes so broad that anyone with unusual qualities might be condemned. Others try to bind and control their psychers without the Imperium's training or resources. They imprison these individuals in isolated facilities, attempting to prevent them from becoming gateways while still utilizing their abilities for divination or communication. Without proper understanding of psychic phenomena, these efforts often fail catastrophically. The bindings prove inadequate. The isolation drives psychers mad. The attempts to use their powers for good purposes create openings that chaos exploits with vicious efficiency. On some worlds, religious authorities attempt to frame psychers as touched by the Emperor, as holy individuals whose powers represent divine favor. They establish monasteries or temples where psykers are sequestered and taught to use their abilities in service of the emperor's faith. In rare cases, this works. A psyker with strong faith and personal discipline might learn to control their powers through prayer and meditation, becoming a source of genuine hope in a dark world. More often, it ends in disaster, as chaos entities disguise themselves as manifestations of the emperor, corrupting well-meaning psykers into becoming servants of the ruinous powers. The demonic incursions that plague abandoned worlds take many forms. Sometimes they are brief and localized, a demon manifesting for moments or hours before being banished back to the warp. These attacks kill dozens or hundreds, leaving behind corrupted areas where reality itself seems unstable, where shadows move with malevolent intelligence and objects twist into unnatural shapes. The survivors speak of the horrors they witnessed in hushed whispers, traumatized by glimpses of entities that should not exist. Other incursions are more sustained, particularly on worlds where multiple factors align to weaken the barrier between reality and the warp. A planet caught in a warp storm might experience constant low-level manifestations, demons appearing and disappearing unpredictably, terrorizing the population and making normal life impossible. Regions where mass death or suffering has occurred become tainted, the negative emotions soaking into the very earth and creating weak points in reality. Cultist activity opens deliberate gateways, summoning demons as servants or objects of worship. In the worst cases, an abandoned world falls completely to chaos, transforming into what the Imperium classifies as a demon world. These planets exist partially or entirely within the warp, their physical laws rewritten according to the whims of the chaos god who claims them. Gravity might vary randomly. Time could flow backwards or loop endlessly. The terrain itself becomes sentient and malevolent, mountains that scream in agony and rivers of boiling blood. The human populations of these worlds are either consumed entirely or transformed into something so changed that they can no longer be called human, their bodies and souls twisted into new forms that serve their dark masters. The transformation into a demon world is not instantaneous. It begins with corruption spreading from nexus points, areas where the warp's influence is strongest. These tainted zones expand gradually, consuming surrounding territories as more souls fall to chaos and more rituals weaken reality. The people living near the expanding corruption zones watch in horror as their world changes around them, familiar landmarks warping into nightmare versions of themselves. They flee if they can, seeking refuge in areas not yet touched, but the corruption follows, patient and inexorable. Eventually, there is nowhere left to run, and they must either succumb to chaos or die fighting a battle they cannot win. The Xenos threat. The galaxy teems with alien life, and almost all of it views humanity as prey, competitor, or resource to be exploited. The Imperium protects its worlds from these threats through overwhelming military force, through the space marines who can be dispatched to combat Xenos incursions, through the Imperial Navy that patrols space lanes and destroys alien vessels before they reach populated planets. This protection is far from perfect. Countless Imperial worlds are invaded, conquered, or destroyed by Xenos races. But the knowledge that the Imperium might respond, that attacking an Imperial world could bring retribution, provides a deterrent that prevents even worse depredations. An abandoned world loses this protection. The Xenos races that patrol the stars, searching for opportunities and weaknesses, quickly identify planets that no longer receive Imperial support. These worlds become targets, marked for invasion or exploitation, or simply casual destruction, depending on the nature of the Xenos involved. The timescale varies. Some aliens might strike quickly, taking advantage of confusion and weakness. Others might wait, watching patiently as the abandoned world collapses under its own weight, planning to claim the wreckage once resistance has crumbled completely. The orcs represent perhaps the most straightforward threat. These green-skinned Xenos exist for war, their entire culture built around combat and conquest. They travel through space in ramshackle vessels held together by technology that should not work but does through some combination of mechanical ingenuity and psychic influence. When orcs encounter an abandoned Imperial world, particularly one showing signs of internal conflict, they descend on it like sharks drawn to blood in water. The fighting provides exactly what they crave: enemies to fight, loot to take, opportunities to prove themselves in battle. For an orc warband, an abandoned world is perfect target. It has infrastructure to raid and destroy. It has humans who will fight back, providing worthy combat. It has resources that can be scavenged to build more weapons and vehicles. The orcs care nothing for why the Imperium has withdrawn. They only care that the withdrawal has created an opportunity for warfare on a scale they find satisfying. They make landfall in crude dropships, howling war cries that echo for kilometers, and immediately begin fighting whatever resistance they encounter. The defensive capabilities of an abandoned world vary enormously, but they are almost always inadequate against a determined orc warg. The PDF might have weapons and training, but orcs are physically powerful, naturally tough, and utterly fearless in combat. They feel no morale breaking, suffer no logistics problems, create weaponry from scrap metal, and refuse. A single orc warband might be repelled, its members killed, and its ships destroyed. But orcs release spores when they die, spores that can lie dormant in soil for years before sprouting into new orcs. A world that successfully fights off one orc attack might find itself fighting feral orc tribes a generation later, the descendants of enemies they thought defeated. Some abandoned worlds reach a grim equilibrium with orc populations, entering a state of perpetual warfare where neither side can achieve final victory. The humans control fortified settlements and cities, venturing out to farm or scavenge only in armed groups. The orcs roam the wilderness and ruins, launching raids when the whim strikes them, content with the endless fighting. This state can persist for generations or even centuries, the original reasons for the conflict forgotten, replaced by simple tribal hatred and the understanding that the war will never end. The Tyranids represent a different category of threat entirely. These extragalactic horrors consume all biomass they encounter, stripping worlds down to bare rock in their insatiable hunger. They are not individual creatures, but a gestalt organism, a hive mind controlling countless bioforms designed for specific purposes. The Tyranids that reach an abandoned world are typically the vanguard organisms, genostealers sent ahead of the main hive fleets to infiltrate and prepare target worlds for consumption. A single genostealer can doom an entire world. These creatures are intelligent, cunning, and possessed of reproductive capabilities that make them perhaps the most insidious threat humanity faces. When a genostealer encounters a human, it can implant genetic material through its clawed fingers or specialized ovipositor. The victim, now called a contagii, returns to their community seemingly unchanged. But they carry the genostealer's genetic legacy, and when they mate, their children will be human genostealer hybrids, the first generation of what will become a cult. These first-generation hybrids are visibly inhuman, with grotesque features that combine the worst aspects of both species. But the cultists perceive them as beautiful, their minds warped by psychic influence from the genostealer patriarch that leads the growing cult. Subsequent generations look increasingly human, able to pass unnoticed among normal populations while spreading the infection further. By the fourth generation, the hybrids are nearly indistinguishable from baseline humans, allowing them to infiltrate positions of power and authority. On an abandoned world, a genostealer cult can grow unchecked. Without the Inquisition to investigate suspicious activities or the black ships to collect psychers who might detect the cult's psychic influence, the infection spreads through the population like a disease. The cult typically operates as a religious or political movement, recruiting from the desperate and downtrodden, promising salvation and unity through service to the Star Children who will come to deliver them. The cultists genuinely believe they are building a better future. The Patriarch's psychic influence ensures their devotion is absolute, their love for their alien progenitor overriding all other concerns. They work tirelessly to prepare their world for the arrival of the Tyranid hive fleet, viewing the approach of the star-devouring Xenos as the fulfillment of prophecy rather than the doom it represents. They sabotage defenses, assassinate leaders who might organize resistance, spread dissent and confusion to ensure the world will be helpless when the time comes. The day of ascension, when the cult finally rises in open rebellion to seize control of the planet, represents the culmination of generations of patient work. The cultists emerge from hiding, revealing themselves as a massive force that has infiltrated every level of society. They overwhelm defenders weakened by internal conflict and resource depletion, claiming the world in the name of their Star Children. And then, in orbit above, the shadow of the hive fleet appears, blotting out the stars. In the final moments, when the Tyranid bioships descend to begin their harvest, the cultists' psychic link to the Patriarch breaks. For the first time, they see clearly what they have done, understand that the Star Children are not saviors, but devourers that will consume them along with everyone else. The horror and betrayal in those final moments is perhaps the cruelest aspect of Genestealer infiltration. The cultists die knowing they damned their entire world through devotion to a lie. The Dark Eldar, those twisted remnants of the ancient Eldari Empire, raid abandoned worlds for a different purpose. These sadistic Xenos exist in the nightmare city of Komorrah, hidden in the webway between real space and the warp. They are a dying race, their souls slowly being consumed by Slanesh, the Chaos God their ancestors' depravity birthed. To stave off this consumption, they feed on the suffering of others, torturing captives in ways designed to produce maximum agony and terror. An abandoned world represents an ideal target for Dark Eldar raids. The lack of Imperial presence means they can strike without fear of Space Marine intervention or Imperial Navy retaliation. The populations are, already weakened and desperate, easy prey for warriors who treat combat as an art form and cruelty as a religion. The Dark Eldar come in fast-moving raiders, appearing from webway portals with no warning, striking isolated settlements or even major population centers. The raids are swift and brutal. The Dark Eldar use advanced technology to paralyze victims, capturing hundreds or thousands in minutes before disappearing back through their portals with their screaming cargo. Those taken are never seen again, their fates too horrible to imagine. The survivors are left traumatized, knowing the raiders could return at any time, that there is no defense against an enemy who can appear and vanish at will. Some communities attempt to appease the Dark Eldar, leaving offerings of captives or treasures at known raid sites, hoping to satisfy the Xenos' appetites and avoid being targeted. It never works. The Dark Eldar view such offerings as signs of weakness, invitations to take more. The Tau, relative newcomers to the galactic stage, represent a different kind of threat to abandoned Imperial worlds. These idealistic Xenos preach a philosophy called the greater good, claiming to offer enlightened cooperation and technological advancement to species who join their expanding empire. They are less overtly threatening than other Xenos races, often approaching isolated human worlds with diplomacy rather than invasion, offering aid and alliance to populations struggling to survive. Some abandoned worlds accept these offers, joining the Tau Empire as client states. The humans who make this choice, called Gwevesa in the Tau language, gain access to Tau technology and resources, improving their standard of living dramatically. But they also abandon their humanity in spiritual terms, rejecting the Emperor's faith and accepting alien rule. From the Imperial perspective, they are traitors who deserve only death. when the Imperium eventually returns to reclaim these worlds, the Gwevesa face extermination regardless of their reasons for turning to the Tau. Necrons represent the most ancient and perhaps most implacable threat. These undying machines were once a biological species, but they transferred their consciousness into immortal metal bodies millions of years ago, becoming weapons of terrible efficiency. They slumbered in tomb worlds throughout the galaxy, but in recent millennia, they have begun to awaken, reclaiming territories they ruled before humanity's ancestors learned to make fire. An abandoned imperial world might sit unknowingly atop a Necron tomb complex. When these ancient machines awaken, they rise from beneath the earth and begin systematically exterminating all life on the surface, reclaiming what they view as rightfully theirs. The Necrons cannot be reasoned with or bargained with. They are utterly without mercy, viewing organic life as an infestation to be purged. A world attacked by Necrons faces extinction unless some miracle allows. Evacuation or outside intervention arrives. Lesser xenospecies, too numerous to catalogue, also prey on abandoned worlds. Orc freebooters, void predator species, nomadic aliens searching for resources, all find easy pickings among planets cut off from Imperial protection. Each attack weakens the world further, killing defenders and destroying infrastructure, creating a downward spiral from which escape becomes increasingly impossible. Survival and adaptation. Not all abandoned worlds collapse entirely into chaos and death. Some, through fortune or foresight or simple geography, manage to maintain functioning societies even without Imperial support. These success stories are rare and usually qualified by significant costs, but they demonstrate that survival is possible for those willing to adapt to their new circumstances. The world's best positioned to survive abandonment are those that were already largely self-sufficient. Agri-worlds that produce their own food, medieval or feudal, worlds that never depended heavily on Imperial technology, isolated colonies that maintained their own manufacturing capabilities. These places experience disruption when the Imperium withdraws, but they possess the fundamentals needed for survival: food, water, basic technology, and social structures that can function without external support. Adaptation often means regression. Technology that cannot be maintained or replaced gradually falls into disuse, replaced by simpler alternatives that can be produced locally. A world that once possessed sophisticated plasma generators might revert to combustion engines, then to wind and water power, then to animal labor. This technological descent is not universal or immediate, but it occurs over generations as irreplaceable components fail and the knowledge to repair them is lost. The people watch their world grow darker in literal terms, the lights going out one by one as the infrastructure of a more advanced age crumbles. Some communities take deliberate steps to preserve knowledge against this decline. They establish libraries or monasteries where books and data storage devices are protected and maintained. They create apprenticeship systems to ensure technical knowledge passes from generation to generation. They select individuals to specialize in different technologies, making them responsible for understanding and maintaining specific systems. These efforts can slow the regression, creating pockets of relatively high technology within worlds that are otherwise slipping into barbarism. The social structures that emerge on abandoned worlds vary enormously, shaped by each world's particular circumstances and the choices made by its leaders and people. Some societies become more authoritarian, concentrating power in the hands of strong leaders who can maintain order and direct resources towards survival. These often take the form of military dictatorships or theocracies, systems where unity and obedience are valued, above individual freedom. The people trade liberty for security, accepting tight control over their lives in exchange for protection and sustenance. Other worlds fragment into smaller communities, rejecting centralized authority in favor of local autonomy. Small settlements become largely independent, managing their own affairs and defending their own territories. This creates a patchwork of different governance systems and cultures, each settlement developing its own unique character. Trade between these communities can be extensive or minimal, depending on geography and politics, but even hostile neighbors typically maintain some level of exchange, bartering goods, and occasionally intermarrying to prevent genetic bottlenecks in small populations. Some abandoned worlds develop systems that would be considered heretical by imperial standards, but prove effective for survival. Democratic governance, where leaders are chosen by popular vote rather than inherited right or imperial appointment. Egalitarian societies that distribute resources more evenly than the strict hierarchies the Imperium preferred. Even cooperation with xenospecies, though this is rare and typically only occurs with races like the Tau, who are willing to coexist with humans rather than simply exploiting or destroying them. The question of faith becomes complex on abandoned worlds. The imperial cult taught that the emperor protects, that faith in him ensures salvation and prosperity. When the emperor's protection fails, when entire worlds are left to suffer and die, some lose faith entirely. Others cling to it more desperately, interpreting abandonment as a test or as punishment for insufficient devotion. Still others reinterpret the faith, developing new theologies that acknowledge the emperor's distance while maintaining his divinity. Religious communities on abandoned worlds often become centers of stability and learning. The ecclesiarchy's infrastructure, even without support from terror, can provide frameworks for social organization. A cathedral might serve as a granary, fortress, and meeting hall. Preachers trained in rhetoric and organization become community leaders. The daily rhythm of prayers and rituals provides comfort and structure in chaotic times. But this success depends on the preacher's willingness to adapt their message to new realities, and not all prove capable of this flexibility. Some abandoned worlds maintain their devotion to the emperor, while developing radically different interpretations of what that devotion requires. They might emphasize different aspects of his nature, focusing on the emperor as a warrior king rather than a god, or as a distant but benevolent father rather than a stern judge. These theological innovations would be condemned as heresy by the ecclesiarchy, but without the ecclesiarchy's presence to enforce orthodoxy, the people are free to worship as they see fit. Defense against external threats requires creativity and cooperation. Abandoned worlds cannot call on Space Marine chapters or the Imperial Navy for help. They must defend themselves using whatever resources they possess. This often means adapting civilian infrastructure for military purposes. Factories that once produced consumer goods are retooled to make weapons. Agricultural equipment is modified into improvised armored vehicles. The entire population might receive basic military training, creating a society where every citizen is a potential soldier. Some worlds establish defensive pacts with neighbors, forming regional alliances that can coordinate responses to threats. These alliances might cover single star systems where multiple settled worlds exist, or extend to neighboring systems if they possess the technology for interstellar travel. The agreements typically involve mutual defense, shared intelligence about threats, and sometimes economic cooperation. But maintaining these alliances is difficult without the overarching authority of the Imperium to enforce compliance. Disputes over resources or strategy can fracture coalitions just when unity is most needed. The creation of new cultures is perhaps the most fascinating aspect of life on abandoned worlds. Cut off from the homogenizing influence of imperial culture, isolated populations begin to diverge, developing customs and traditions unique to their circumstances. Language shifts over generations, creating dialects and eventually entirely new tongues. Art and literature reflect the particular experiences of abandonment, creating mythologies around the time before the Imperium left, and hopes for eventual return or rescue. These new cultures are not simply degraded versions of imperial culture, but genuine alternatives, representing different ways of being human. A world might develop sophisticated philosophical traditions around the nature of suffering and survival. Another might create art forms that express the peculiar beauty and horror of life without the Emperor's light. Children growing up on these worlds know the Imperium only through stories, if at all. They have their own heroes and villains, their own holidays and celebrations, their own dreams of the future. Some abandoned worlds achieve a stability that allows population growth and even prosperity. They overcome the initial crisis of isolation and establish sustainable systems for food production, resource management, and social organization. Generations pass in relative peace, the memory of the Imperium fading into legend. These worlds represent the best-case scenario for abandonment, places where humanity continues and even thrives without imperial oversight. But even these success stories exist in shadow of uncertainty. They cannot know if their world will be rediscovered by the Imperium, or invaded by Xenos, or consumed by a warp storm. They live with the knowledge that their isolation could end at any moment, and that ending might bring salvation or destruction with equal probability. The people of abandoned worlds learn to live with this uncertainty, finding meaning and purpose despite the knowledge that they have been forgotten by the wider galaxy. The lost generations. Children born on an abandoned world grow up in circumstances vastly different from those experienced by the generations before them. They inherit a world in decline, a society struggling to maintain itself against impossible odds, knowledge that they are alone in a galaxy full of horrors. The stories their parents and grandparents tell of the Imperium seem like fairy tales, describing a time when ships came from the stars, when powerful warriors protected humanity, when the Emperor's light reached every corner of the galaxy. These children do not remember life under Imperial rule. They have known only the reality of abandonment, only the daily struggle for survival in a world slowly coming apart. This fundamentally changes their relationship with the Imperium and the Emperor. To them, these are not immediate presences, but abstract concepts, historical entities whose relevance to their current lives is unclear. Why should they worship an emperor who abandoned their world? Why should they maintain faith in an Imperium that left them to die? The education of these children reflects the changed circumstances of their world. Where once there might have been scholar progeniums teaching imperial doctrine and preparing students for service to Terra, there are now makeshift schools focused on practical skills needed for survival. Children learn to farm or hunt, to repair machinery with scavenged parts, to fight with whatever weapons are available. Reading and writing might still be taught, but often from degraded textbooks or oral traditions, with inevitable errors creeping in as knowledge passes from generation to generation. The loss of technical knowledge is particularly tragic. Complex technologies require extensive training to understand and maintain. When the experts who possessed this knowledge die without passing it on completely, the information is lost forever. A community might have a working power generator, but lack anyone who truly understands how it functions. They perform maintenance rituals taught to them, but cannot troubleshoot problems or repair major damage. When the generator inevitably fails, they might be unable to restore it, losing access to electrical power entirely. This pattern repeats across all areas of technology. Medical knowledge declines as trained doctors die, and their replacements learn only what can be taught through limited resources and hands-on experience. Manufacturing capabilities decrease as specialized tools wear out and cannot be replaced. Agricultural techniques regress as the chemicals and equipment that enabled high yields become unavailable. Each generation possesses slightly less knowledge and capability than the one before. A slow erosion of human potential that seems impossible to reverse. Some communities attempt to preserve knowledge through deliberate programs. They identify promising young people and train them intensively in specific fields, ensuring at least some expertise survives. They create apprenticeship systems where masters pass knowledge to students over years of hands-on work. They maintain libraries or data archives, protecting them as carefully as food stores or weapons stockpiles. These efforts can slow knowledge loss, but rarely prevent it entirely. The demands of survival are too immediate, requiring labor that could have been spent on education or training. Language evolution on abandoned worlds accelerates dramatically. Without the standardizing influence of Imperial Gothic, as enforced through administratum bureaucracy and ecclesiarchy services, local dialects begin to diverge. Within a few generations, people on different parts of the same planet might struggle to understand each other. New words enter the vocabulary, describing concepts unique to post-abandonment existence. Old words are forgotten or their meanings shift. Without written standards or centralized education, these linguistic changes happen rapidly and irreversibly. Some worlds fragment into dozens of different languages, each community developing its own tongue, influenced by pre-imperial languages that had been suppressed, or by the particular circumstances of survival. This linguistic diversity creates barriers to communication and cooperation, making it harder for different communities to work together against common threats. It also represents a profound cultural shift, as language shapes thought and perception. People speaking different languages may develop genuinely different ways of understanding their world and their place in it. The physical changes that occur across generations are equally significant. Mutation has always been a concern on imperial worlds, carefully monitored and suppressed by the Adeptus Arbites and ecclesiarchy. When these authorities are gone, mutants face different fates depending on their community's attitudes. Some societies maintain the imperial practice of executing mutants, viewing genetic purity as a religious or practical necessity. Others become more accepting, recognizing that in a population declining due to violence and starvation, they cannot afford to kill viable members over physical differences. In some cases, mutation becomes endemic. Exposure to radiation from failing reactors, consumption of tainted food or water, the influence of chaos in corrupted regions, all contribute to genetic damage that accumulates over generations. Some mutations are relatively benign, extra fingers or unusual skin pigmentation. Others are more severe, causing health problems or physical disabilities. The worst involve clear corruption by chaos, producing individuals who are barely recognizable as human. Communities must decide how to handle these cases, balancing compassion with the danger that chaos-tainted individuals pose. The concept of the Emperor and the Imperium evolves in the minds of the lost generations. Children raised by parents who still remember imperial rule hear stories of the time before abandonment, but these stories take on mythological qualities. The Emperor becomes a figure like gods in ancient human religions, a powerful being who may or may not have ever truly manifested on their world. The Imperium becomes a golden age that may or may not have existed, a time when food was plentiful and protection guaranteed. Some young people develop a kind of cargo cult mentality, performing rituals they believe will bring the Imperium back. They maintain radio beacons, broadcasting into the void in hopes of attracting attention. They preserve imperial symbols and artifacts as sacred relics. They conduct ceremonies on dates they believe mark important imperial holidays, though the precise timing and meaning may have been corrupted through generations of transmission. These practices bring comfort and hope, allowing belief that their suffering is temporary, that rescue will eventually come. Others reject the Emperor entirely, viewing worship of a being who abandoned them as foolish or even obscene. They develop new belief systems or embrace older ones, returning to faiths that predated the imperial truth. Some become entirely secular, finding meaning in survival itself, rather than in service to higher powers. These philosophical shifts can cause serious conflicts within communities, particularly when the faithful view rejection of the Emperor's heresy deserving punishment, while the irreligious see enforced worship as oppressive. The concept of childhood itself changes on abandoned worlds, facing existential threats. In stable imperial societies, children might spend years in education before entering productive work. On struggling abandoned worlds, such luxury is impossible. Children begin contributing to their family's survival as soon as they are physically capable, working in fields or factories, or taking on domestic duties that free adults for more demanding labor. Play and education become secondary to survival, stolen moments rather than expected rights. This creates harder generations, people who have known only struggle, who view hardship as the natural state of existence. They lack the softness that comes from security, the ability to imagine better futures that characterized life under imperial protection. But they also possess strengths their ancestors lacked. They are resourceful, capable of finding solutions with limited resources. They are resilient, having survived conditions that would have broken people raised in easier times. They are connected to their world in ways that off-world governors and administrators never were, understanding its rhythms and realities through lived experience. The stories these generations tell themselves become a form of cultural DNA, encoding lessons about survival and identity. They pass down knowledge of which plants are safe to eat, which water sources are contaminated, which ruins should be avoided because of the things that dwell there. They create legends explaining why they are alone, ranging from accurate historical accounts to elaborate mythologies involving divine punishment or cosmic abandonment. These stories help the young people make sense of their circumstances and provide frameworks for understanding their place in a universe that seems to have forgotten them. Some abandoned worlds maintain hope across generations through elaborate belief in eventual return or rescue. They teach their children that the Imperium has not forgotten them, but is merely delayed, that someday the ships will come again and everything will be made right. This hope sustains people through incredible hardships, giving them reason to maintain imperial traditions and preserve knowledge against the day when they can rejoin the wider Imperium. But it can also become a burden, preventing adaptation to new realities, keeping communities locked in patterns that no longer serve them. Others embrace their isolation, developing pride in their independence and self-reliance. They teach their children that the Imperium's absence is liberation rather than abandonment, that they are better off governing themselves than submitting to distant terror's authority. These communities often develop the strongest and most distinctive cultures, unrestricted by imperial orthodoxy. But they also tend to view eventual rediscovery with dread rather than hope, knowing that the Imperium will not tolerate their deviations from sanctioned belief and practice. When the Imperium returns, the Imperium's borders are not static. They expand and contract. Worlds are lost and reclaimed. Crusades push into unexplored territories, while other regions are abandoned as indefensible. Sometimes a world that was thought lost forever is rediscovered, appearing on the scanners of an explorator fleet or encountered by a rogue trader seeking new opportunities. Sometimes the Strategic Council deliberately decides to reconquer a region that was previously written off, launching crusades to bring lapsed worlds back into the fold. And sometimes the Imperium simply stumbles upon lost colonies as navigators find new warp routes or ancient star charts are recovered. When the Imperium returns to a world it once abandoned, the results are rarely cause for celebration. The people who lived through decades or centuries of isolation, who built new lives and new societies in the Emperor's absence, discover that their suffering was not the end of their trials, but merely a prelude to new horrors. The Imperium does not forgive deviation from orthodoxy. It does not recognize independence or respect local customs that developed during abandonment. It comes to reclaim what it considers its property, and it will accept nothing less than total submission. The rediscovery typically begins with a long-range scan detecting signs of human habitation where the Administratum's records show an abandoned world. This prompts closer investigation. Ships enter the system and begin analyzing the planet's emissions, looking for evidence of technology and organization. They monitor communications if any are being broadcast. They observe from orbit, building a picture of what the world has become in the Imperium's absence. The initial contact varies depending on what the Imperium finds. If the world appears to have maintained some semblance of order and Imperial faith, the approach might be relatively benign. Representatives arrive with promises of reconnection, offering the benefits of rejoining the Imperium in exchange for resumed compliance. They speak of protection from Xenos threats, access to trade networks, the Emperor's blessing restored. Some abandoned worlds welcome this return, viewing it as the answer to generations of prayers. They accept the Imperium's terms, eagerly, desperate to rejoin the larger human civilization they were separated from. But often, the initial contact reveals a world that has deviated too far from Imperial orthodoxy to be easily reintegrated. The Imperium discovers populations that have abandoned the Emperor's worship, or that have developed heresies and deviations in their theology. They find governments that reject Terra's authority, claiming local sovereignty. They encounter societies that have made alliances with Xenos species, or that have been infiltrated by chaos cults, or that have mutated beyond acceptable limits. In these cases, the Imperium's approach is far less gentle. The Inquisition becomes involved, sending representatives to assess the degree of corruption. They investigate the population, conducting interrogations and examinations to determine who can be saved and who must be purged. They burn heretical texts and destroy monuments to false gods. They execute anyone suspected of chaos worship or Xenos. Collaboration, often in public displays, meant to terrorize the population into compliance. The message is clear: the Imperium has returned, and deviation will not be tolerated. For worlds that have genuinely fallen to chaos, the judgment is swift and terrible. Exterminatus, the complete destruction of all life on a planet's surface, might be ordered. Virus bombs or cyclonic torpedoes rain down from orbit, annihilating entire civilizations in firestorms that consume continents. The world is left as a lifeless husk, its atmosphere burned away, its surface reduced to glass and ash. Better this than allow a demon world to exist within the Imperium's borders, or so the Inquisition reasons. The billions who die in the cleansing fire die as examples and warnings to other worlds that might consider abandoning the Emperor's light. Even for worlds that are deemed salvageable, the process of reintegration is brutal. The Imperium does not merely want compliance, it demands it be demonstrated, through suffering and sacrifice. The population might be subjected to tithes far exceeding what they could possibly provide, forcing them to give up their food stores and valuables as penance for their time outside Imperial authority. Young people are conscripted en masse into the Imperial Guard, sent to fight in distant wars as proof of their loyalty. Infrastructure is seized by the Adeptus Mechanicus or the Administratum, local ownership disregarded. Cultural suppression is systematic and thorough. The languages that developed during isolation are banned, with only Imperial Gothic permitted in official contexts. Local customs and traditions are examined for heretical elements and purged if they deviate from ecclesiarchy doctrine. Art and literature that does not glorify the Emperor is destroyed. The people are forced to abandon their identities, to forget the unique cultures they developed, and embrace homogenized Imperial orthodoxy. Resistance to this cultural genocide is met with violence. The cruelest irony is that the people who struggled to survive without the Imperium, who maintained what faith they could and preserved what knowledge they had, are often treated as suspects rather than victims. Their suffering during abandonment counts for nothing in the Imperium's calculus. They are judged not by what they endured, but by how closely they adhered to Imperial orthodoxy during that endurance. A world that maintained perfect faith despite terrible hardship receives little more consideration than one that embraced heresy, because both existed outside Imperial control and must be brought back into compliance through force. For those who accepted the Imperium's absence as liberation rather than tragedy, the return is catastrophic. Communities that developed democratic governance are forced back into autocracy. Societies that achieved gender equality or other social progress are forced to adopt the Imperium's hierarchical structures. People who had built lives, based on cooperation with Xenos allies, watch those allies destroyed and are themselves executed as traitors for the crime of survival through pragmatism. The Imperium recognizes no circumstance that justifies deviation from its doctrines. Children who grew up never knowing the Imperium find themselves subject to authorities whose legitimacy they do not recognize. They are forced to worship an emperor they have never felt the presence of, to serve an institution that contributed nothing to their survival. Many resist, which leads to brutal suppression. The Imperium views these young people as particularly dangerous because they lack the proper indoctrination from birth. They are watched constantly, suspected of heresy for the simple crime of having been born on an abandoned world. The Adeptus Ministorum arrives to restore proper worship, but their version of the Emperor's faith often bears little resemblance to the traditions that developed during isolation. Local saints and martyrs are declared apocryphal or heretical. Prayer forms that evolved independently are condemned as corrupted. The genuine faith that sustained people through their darkest hours is dismissed as inadequate or worse. New preachers arrive to teach the correct doctrines, and those who insist on maintaining their own traditions are branded as heretics. Some rediscovered worlds resist the Imperium's return militarily. They have survived without Imperial support and see no reason to surrender their independence now. They refuse to pay tithes or provide soldiers. They bar Imperial ships from landing and shoot down any that try. These rebellions are inevitably crushed, though the time it takes varies depending on the world's defenses and the Imperium's available resources. Space Marine chapters might be deployed to break particularly stubborn resistance, their bolters and chainswords making short work of defenders who lack comparable military power. The aftermath of reconquest leaves deep scars. Populations are reduced through purges and conscription. Infrastructure is damaged or destroyed in the fighting. The survivors live under occupation, watched constantly by Arbites and inquisitorial agents, their every action scrutinized for signs of disloyalty. Trust between the people and their new rulers is non-existent. The Imperium rules through fear and force, the only methods it knows, and the resentment this breeds ensures that these worlds will never be stable or fully compliant. For some individuals, the Imperium's return offers opportunities. Those who can prove they maintained the faith and resisted heresy during abandonment might be elevated to positions of authority as rewards. Collaborators who help identify heretics or Xenos sympathizers gain favor with the new authorities. The desperate and opportunistic remake themselves as loyal Imperial citizens, abandoning their communities and histories to serve the conquerors. But even these collaborators are never fully trusted, always suspected of hiding their true allegiances. The rediscovery of abandoned worlds creates documentation in the Administratum's endless archives, but the records tell only the official version of events. They note that a lost world was reclaimed, heresy purged, compliance restored. They record the number of soldiers conscripted and the quantity of resources tithed. They do not record the destroyed cultures, the executed innocents, the families separated and sent to different corners of the galaxy. They do not acknowledge that the Imperium's rescue often inflicted more harm than the abandonment ever did. Not all rediscoveries end in tragedy. Occasionally, very occasionally, the Imperium finds a world that maintained its faith and cohesion so perfectly that reintegration can be relatively smooth. These rare cases are celebrated as miracles, proof of the Emperor's power and the righteousness of Imperial doctrine. But even these success stories involve painful adjustments as the world is brought back into compliance with regulations and requirements it may have never needed during its isolation. The price of reunion is always paid, one way or another. Conclusion: Eternal Darkness. In the year 41,000 and beyond, the Imperium of Man stands as the largest political entity in the galaxy, controlling approximately 1 million worlds and protecting trillions upon trillions of human souls. It is an empire built on faith and blood, sustained through 10 millennia by the sacrifice of billions, and the absolute authority of the God Emperor who sits upon the golden throne. It claims dominion over all of humanity, whether known or unknown, discovered or lost. Every human world, it insists, is part of the Imperium, protected by the Emperor's light. But this claim is a fiction, a necessary lie that the administratum tells itself to maintain the illusion of control. The truth, recorded in archives that few will ever see, is that the Imperium loses worlds constantly to warp. Storms that isolate entire sectors, to xenos, invasions that overwhelm defenses, to internal rebellions that spiral out of control, to simple bureaucratic oversight that causes worlds to slip between the cracks of the vast administrative machinery. The rate of loss fluctuates, sometimes faster and sometimes slower, but it never stops. The Imperium is not expanding. It is contracting, slowly bleeding territory and population to forces it cannot entirely control. The number of abandoned worlds is unknown and unknowable. Some estimates suggest there could be tens of thousands of human-settled planets cut off from Imperial contact, though the true figure could be higher or lower by orders of magnitude. These worlds exist in a state of limbo, neither fully part of the Imperium nor entirely independent of it. Their populations might number in the trillions, all living and dying beyond the reach of the Emperor's supposed protection, forgotten by the galaxy they thought would remember them forever. Each abandoned world represents a unique tragedy, for no two experiences of isolation are identical. Some fall quickly, consumed by chaos or xenos within years of the Imperium's withdrawal. Others survive for centuries, building new civilizations from the wreckage of the old. Some maintain their faith in the Emperor despite all evidence that he has forgotten them. Others embrace new beliefs or return to old ones, finding meaning in traditions the Imperium sought to erase. The diversity of human experience on these worlds would be celebrated in a less rigid civilization, but the Imperium views it only as deviation to be corrected through force. The people born on abandoned worlds live lives of particular poignancy. They are Imperial citizens by birthright, but have never known the Imperium's protection. They carry the genetic legacy of humanity's conquest of the stars, but exist in isolation from that legacy. They are taught to worship an emperor who seems to have abandoned them to maintain faith in an institution that provided them nothing. Yet many do maintain that faith, finding in it a source of strength and purpose that sustains them through impossible hardships. The psychological impact of abandonment cannot be overstated. Every generation raised in isolation must confront fundamental questions about meaning and purpose. If the Emperor is truly divine and all-knowing, why has he allowed their suffering? If the Imperium represents humanity's best hope for survival, why has it forsaken them? These questions have no satisfying answers, only the cold reality that the galaxy is vast and cruel, that even the mightiest empire cannot protect all of its citizens, that some must be sacrificed so that others might survive. The abandoned worlds serve as mirrors reflecting the Imperium's fundamental weaknesses. They demonstrate that the Empire's control is illusory, that its claims of protecting humanity are propaganda rather than reality. They show what happens when the Imperium's support structures are removed, revealing how dependent its citizens have become on systems they do not understand and cannot maintain. They prove that the Imperium's greatest strength, its size and reach, is also its greatest vulnerability, for an empire so vast cannot possibly govern effectively. And yet, in their darkest way, the abandoned worlds also demonstrate human resilience and adaptability. People find ways to survive conditions that should be unsurvivable. They build new societies from ruins. They maintain culture and knowledge despite losing access to the resources that sustain them. They create meaning and find purpose in circumstances that seem designed to crush all hope. The human spirit, it seems, is harder to kill than the Imperium sometimes imagines. The future holds little comfort for the abandoned worlds. The Imperium shows no signs of becoming more stable or better able to maintain contact with its distant territories. The forces that cause worlds to be lost, warp storms, and Xenos invasions and internal conflicts are growing more severe rather than less. The opening of the Great Rift in the 41st Millennium, that massive tear in reality stretching across the galaxy, has cut off entire sectors from Terra, creating what is called the Imperium Nihilus, or Dark Imperium, where millions of worlds exist in near total isolation from the Astronomican's light. These newly isolated worlds are experiencing now what countless others have experienced before them. The initial confusion and denial, the growing realization that help is not coming, the breakdown of order as resources dwindle and authority erodes, the emergence of threats from within and without, the desperate struggle to survive in a galaxy that has moved on without them. They are learning the lesson that abandoned worlds have always taught, that the Emperor's protection is not guaranteed, that the Imperium's reach has limits, that survival ultimately depends on what you can do for yourself rather than what distant authorities might do for you. For those of us who study these matters, who compile the histories that the Administratum would prefer to ignore, the abandoned worlds represent both warning and record. They warn us that the Imperium's ultimate failure is not an if, but a when, that the system that has sustained humanity for 10,000 years cannot last forever. They record what happens when that system fails, providing a glimpse of what might await all of humanity should the Imperium finally collapse entirely. And they demonstrate that even in that collapse, even in the darkness that would follow, humanity might find ways to continue, to survive, to build something new from the ashes of what was lost. The people of abandoned worlds deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their stories told, their struggles acknowledged, their suffering recognized. They are victims of a system that claims to value all human life, but in practice treats people as resources to be expended and territories as assets to be held or abandoned based on strategic calculations. They were promised the Emperor's protection and received only his silence. They were told they were part of something greater and discovered they were expendable components in a machine that would grind forward without them. If you find yourself listening to these words, you live in a galaxy where abandonment is always possible. No world is too important to lose, no population too valuable to sacrifice. The protection you believe you have, the security you take for granted, rests on foundations more fragile than you imagine. The ships that bring food and supplies could stop coming tomorrow. The communications that connect you to the wider Imperium could fall silent. The protection that keeps Xenos raiders and Chaos cultists at bay could be withdrawn to serve more pressing needs elsewhere. And if that happens, you will discover what generations before you have learned, that you are alone in the darkness, that survival depends on your own efforts, that the Imperium's promises mean nothing when weighed against the brutal mathematics of galactic logistics. This is the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the bitter knowledge that for millions of worlds, even that war is fought without them, their fates considered too insignificant to merit attention from those who control humanity's destiny. To live on an abandoned world is to understand humanity's place in the galaxy, not as masters of the stars, but as survivors clinging to existence in the spaces between greater powers, hoping to be overlooked by the forces that would destroy us, praying to gods who may or may not hear our pleas. In the end, perhaps that is the truest revelation of what it means to live on a world abandoned by the Imperium. It teaches you that you were never as important as you believed, that the grand narratives of human dominion and divine protection were always lies, told to make the suffering bearable, that you are and have always been alone in the darkness, sustained only by what you can provide for yourself and the others struggling beside you in the endless night. If you enjoyed learning about this dark corner of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue exploring the grim darkness of the far future and bringing you deep dives into the lore that makes this setting so compelling. Thank you for watching, and remember, in the darkness of abandonment, humanity's true character is revealed.